So, you're in the right place if you came for the continuing Center for Story speaker series. Who has been to one of these before? Who's first time? Awesome. All right, a lot of newbies. Well, welcome. I'm Sean Murphy, so I probably haven't met most of you. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah, which right now is mostly a virtual space. We are starting a master's in storytelling and narrative soon, in the next year or so, and I'm going to be sponsoring as much free programming as I can directed for students. We have our monthly speaker series. We're going to launch a podcast, video cast. We're going to have a story festival at least once a year, and as many other fun things as we can scare up. But as it relates to the speaker series, what I try to do a few times a semester is bring in an expert from a field that is either directly related to what we think we know what story is, but what I'm really trying to do is kind of get outside the box. And part of what the Story Center is doing is examining how story is really part of everything. So if we look at any endeavor, any profession, narrative and story is a part of it. So whether we're talking about sales or law, obviously the arts, there are elements of story, and those elements are always changing. They're impacted by technology, they're impacted by current events. But I think as we go through this series and talking to different people, we'll all get a better understanding of how experts use effective storytelling to be better at what they do. So, I'm lucky to have a pretty wide network of friends from my professional and kind of artistic career, which has meant I've had the good fortune of being friends and colleagues with people who are the best at what they do. And today is not only no exception. This is a gentleman that I've known for decades, and he and I have been talking about politics and how story and narrative work in entertainment, in the political arena, and elsewhere. As you'll see, he's an extraordinarily connected, smart, and passionate guy. This is Mike Shields. I'm going to introduce him, and then we'll ask him to talk a little bit about his story so you can kind of get a better sense of his background. So this is the official biography. And before I start, I say this at the beginning of every Q&A is not only welcome but encouraged, and I don't want to wait till the end. So as we go through, if you've got a question or a comment, just shoot your hand up. We'll get you involved. So please don't be shy. We want to make sure if there are specific questions or areas of concern that we might be able to address, we want to do that. So Mike is founder of Convergence Media, a boutique marketing, branding, and public affairs agency. Convergence has quickly grown to become the premier marketing agency in the political and government space. Mike brings more than 30 years of experience working at the national political level and has led party committees, outside groups, and major campaigns. He now splits time between his Virginia and Georgia offices and his home in Florida with his amazing wife, Katie, and his son, Aiden. That barely scratches the surface, but will do for now. Everyone, please help me welcome Mike Shields. So we're in the presence of greatness. Mike, we seldom have difficulty getting right down to brass tacks, but I think the best way to kick it off, obviously, would be, in addition to the official bio, talk us through how you have always had a passion for politics, how you cultivated a career based on your interests and your expertise, and kind of how your journey has progressed from being a passionate bystander to a major player in that world.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, Sean. It's such a thrill to be with Sean here, to do anything, but especially in this type of environment, this type of event. It's just the neatest thing in the world for me to get to do this. So thank you all for coming and listening to us talk. We'll try not to get into old inside stories for how long we've known each other. But yeah, look, I'm very lucky, that I don't work a day in my life because I love what I do. And it's something I always wanted to do. I grew up in England. My mother's English. My father was American, and he had met her in the 50s. when he was stationed over there in the military. They moved to America. I was born in America. And then when he retired from the military, he got a job in Britain that for them was moving back and was me moving over there. And so for 6 years, I was a little British kid wearing a school uniform, and we were there on a NATO mission at the time, and so politics was an everyday conversation. World events, not really politics. What was going on in the world? When we used to read newspapers and watch the news at a certain time, was very much a part of our daily life, and so it's something I became more and more interested in. And then maybe we'll get into the specific story of what happened when I really got into when I was 12 years old. That's a bit of a story, but it's something that I grew very interested in. Then I went to an American boarding school in England, and from there I wanted to work I knew I wanted to work in politics, and so I came to be near Washington, D.C., because it just avails you of opportunities that you can't get when you're elsewhere. And one of the lessons I give a lot of people that want to work in that type of space, which I still think is true, even though we're such a connected world remotely now, is that it's very helpful to be where the action is, to be there so you can have human interactions and human relationships. And that was very true for me. That's why I wound up at George Mason University, which I'd never seen. I wasn't able to go and do college visits. The first time I saw it was at orientation. But that decision had a huge impact on my life. First of all, because I met Sean Murphy when I was a freshman, but secondly, because it really helped me pursue my career and be near where the game of politics was. And so from there, I worked my way up. I won't go through all the jobs that I had, but the most important job that I had was a job where I had to get up. This is just, I love telling this story to young people. A job where I had to be at work at 4 o'clock in the morning because I was doing clips, newspaper clips. And they were called clips because these were newspapers printed on newsprint that I used scissors to clip the articles out from. The reason I got to work at 4 a.m. was that was the earliest the papers were delivered. If they were delivered at 3:30, they would have been there at 3:30 because I had to have the clips ready for the chairman of the organization I was working at, who showed up at 7 a.m. on his desk. And it was a brutal job. It was hard, especially when I was 23 and living with a bunch of other young dudes that were having fun. And I was going to bed every night at like 7 o'clock or something. But it was by far the best learning experience I ever had. And one of the huge lessons for me in that was two other people turned down that job before I got it. I was the third choice because no young person really wanted to do that work. It was total grunt work. But I was able to, I walked around the building. It was a huge organization. It was the Republican National Committee, so it was the campaign party headquarters. I was able to walk around the building and meet all the senior staff every day, bringing them their clips. And the only thing they knew about me, the only story they knew of me, the only brand that I had was, that kid's busting his tail to get in here every day, which is a great brand. I mean, I would much rather be known about that when I was 23 than anything. Additionally, so then I started building relationships with all of them in a way that if I was in a cube somewhere stuck in a higher up job, I never would have had the chance to do. And then thirdly, I was exposing myself to the news and what was going on in the world. So I had like a speed education on policy, on politics, and how it was being synthesized by the people around me and what they were looking for, what they needed to hear from me as almost a news aggregator for them. Those things combined, I had a lot of other jobs in my career. I still think that was the most important one because of the speed that I learned, the orders of magnitude of increase in my capabilities from that job. But that was a job, the number one requirement of that job was to get up and just work hard. And just, cut things out with scissors. It wasn't using my intelligence or intellect for anything. It was show up and get the job done. And that mattered more than anything I could have done. So anyway, there's an initial story to tell.
Well, and so that's not only appropriate, right, as setting the tone for how story and how we receive narratives change due to technology. It also, unfortunately, shows our age. We came of age pre-internet, so believe it or not, there are people alive that used to live without internet. But I think that's an important distinction because when we talk about how politics is understood, the process, like all through the 19th and 20th centuries, was there was a news cycle. and that news was printed on newsprint, but the newspapers and then eventually the TV newscasts would give us the news cycle, what the story or the stories of the day were, and it was a lot easier to navigate and work within the constraints of that information system. What Mike and I have lived through, and Mike, I shouldn't say Mike myself, I've lived through it, but Mike has lived professionally through not only the internet and the ability to be on brand or be messaging and responding to news 24/7, but now with social media, we've just poured gasoline in ways that I think are both good and bad. It's both. It's the good, the bad, the ugly of how the internet and social media has just completely put everything at speed so that we're all reacting to events. And now, not only did the internet give news agencies the opportunity to be in constant contact, now citizens are newsmakers, legitimately, both literally and figuratively, whether it's through Twitter or Facebook. Someone with a camera and a phone can break news. Mike, talk a little bit about how we are now. I mean, we can just fast forward, we can cycle back, but now here we are in 2025 with all the things I just mentioned. What's germane to younger folks that are trying to get a handle on how do I make sense of fake news, or how do I understand what's real, because everyone's got an opinion. I think we're in the business of trying to really understand what's worthwhile. How does one get engaged? How does one understand all this info overload? That's an impossibly broad question, but basically taking the understanding that we come from the old school, and we've kind of navigated technology as it's enabled basically the access of all this info all the time. How do we navigate it now in the most efficient way?
I actually find that younger people are better equipped to handle that challenge than we are, or certainly our parents are. So we recognize it as a huge problem, and certainly the media that covers media likes to hype it up as this massive problem. It is. But I actually believe that the younger you go, the more equipped they are, because they've grown up in an environment where they've already known that half the stuff I look at is not true, and people posting things may not know what they're talking about, and I need to spend my own time to learn both what the facts are, but also what my own perspective is. And I may be getting influenced by being around certain people, which is human nature. Like, we've always been influenced by the people we're around, whether or not you're from a certain region in a county in this part of the country, and so because you're from there, you're influenced by that, or you're in a certain religion, and so you're influenced by that. We're influenced by our groups, our chats, and our people. That's always been the case, and so the kids are all right. Like, they have an innate way, I think, of seeing through a lot of stuff that we're probably more worried about. I think the hardest generation for it are like our parents, like either the greatest generation or the boomers in particular, because for them, there was this structured news delivery, and so when they see a story on Facebook, it's, well, that's the news, and the news is where the truth comes from, or someone responsibly told me something, and it's a huge disconnect for them to say, wait a minute, I need to ask some questions about that. I think the further you go down in the age chart, the much more likely they are to go, I'm going to ask a lot of questions about that, I don't know where this is from. But that is the secret to it, right, is you don't want to be so cynical you don't believe anything anyone ever says. But, everyone has to, I think, educate themselves in the ways that, from the places that they trust. And there is no, people ask me this all the time when I'm giving talks. Well, is there a website, a news site that you would say isn't biased that you would trust? And I'm like, no, I think you have to actually aggregate a bunch of different sites and try to look at one story in multiple places and see how they're all coming at it. And eventually you can cobble together the truth from whatever the truth is, your perspective on the truth from it.
Okay, so let me get a read on the room. Who here, by show of hands, very generally, considers themselves politically engaged or politically interested, like aware or at least interested in what's going on politically? Okay, and then show of hands, where do most of us get where do we consider where we get our news sources from? Traditional digital copies of the newspapers, or so by show of hands, social media, digital newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, both, the news on TV. What am I not mentioning? Just shout out if I'm like, where does anyone get their news from that I didn't mention? Okay, parents. Podcasts, okay. Who podcasts? Show of hands. Who gets political engagement? And then very broad, but just based on where you're getting your news or your info. Show of hands. You generally feel what you've locked into is reliable, or you was yes or yes, reliable, that you, whatever you've curated or wherever you go, and who is skeptical wherever they go, whether when any of these sources are kind of wary of media. Yeah, so it's a mix I would have expected. I would say Mike and I have literally talked about politics since we've known each other, but I think we would both agree today, and we would have agreed in the 80s. One thing that unites both parties is a suspicion of the media. And I think in a lot of ways that's good. I think you already articulated how that almost puts the onus on the individual to aggregate and check and not rely on one voice, because that voice can either be wrong, they can be manipulative, they can be sketchy. But I do feel like a suspicion and almost a dislike of the media has become alarmingly more commonplace. Am I wrong about that, or what's your take on the healthy or unhealthy or both relationship between the American population and you have to do the media, but because media incorporates obviously a lot of different things, but the relationship.
Yeah, in your intro, one of the things you said that struck me was storytelling in many different mediums, avenues, places in society. You mentioned even legal and in courts. One of the approaches that I take to campaigns is if the voters are a jury and we are prosecuting a case in front of them, and that actually leads me to story. We can get into that, that it's important for what you're talking about, because in so many court cases, one of the things, you have something called a reliable witness, and two people can see, literally, there could be a car accident that takes place on this street right behind us, and we could watch it, and then you could pull us apart and ask us what happened, and people would have all literally just watched the exact same thing, but yet have different accounts of what happened. And we all bring something into that. Well, I think that car pulled out too quickly. I think he was driving just fine, and the other car hit him. And so that gets very, very complicated when you get into this conversation, right? Because people have different perspectives, and so when they're saying, well, this is 100% the truth, and when if you can have empathy and put yourself into their shoes, you can say, I can see why you thought that car was going too fast. And I understand, maybe from experiences that you've had of cars going too fast or an accident you were in, that is the truth to you, that you would bet your life on it. And somebody else would say, I think it was going just fine, based upon all, and they're right as well. And so it gets extremely complicated to take that and filter it through into corporate media, who have a whole bunch of other reasons why they're reporting something other than what I just described. Even though what I just described is enough to cause a huge problem when it comes to disseminating what people believe is happening. And so, look, I was a commentator at CNN for 8 years, I believe, and one of my missions, not on the screen, is sometimes on the screen, but behind the scenes, was to beg my colleagues there to please keep America's faith in the institution of the media, because we need it so badly. When you travel around the world and you go and you look at an emerging democracy somewhere, and you start to weigh how far along on the democratic scale are they, how much can we trust that they are progressing to be a healthy democracy? One of the measurements we have is how independent and trusted are the media in that country, or how much are they state-run and controlled, or how much are they corporate-owned and controlled, and therefore have an agenda and are bending the thoughts of the people. That's how we rate democracies. And so even our founders knew that that the media was very, very important. And it's in the First Amendment. And so the trends have been going like this for a long time. The current president, back, before I even got into politics, that the country has slowly ticked down over time how much faith they have in traditional mainstream media. And now it's at an all-time low. It has just crashed. And so I think it's probably irreparable, and that we just have to understand there's a new paradigm for how people get their information. So if I could go back to myself 6 years ago at CNN, I probably wouldn't waste my breath trying to help them be better and more trusted, because they as an institution are probably over, and we're just watching them slowly die off and collapse as new ways of people getting information become more prominent. And there's a lot of fear mongering about that. Oh my God, what does that mean? We as a society have got to ask ourselves and answer some pretty tough questions about how it is that we go about creating that new paradigm.
Yeah, and so, one of the things I'm a political animal, but I don't have any direct experience in politics. But when I think about story, when I think about the things Mike just talked about, one of the things I say over and over again when I speak to different audiences is from the world that I grew up in, especially as it relates to art, it's generally been a total positive that there's been a democratization of content through the internet, through social media. So voices that couldn't be heard in a different era, and I mean that in terms of diversity, access to technology, access to representation, whether you're a writer or a musician, a blogger, you have the capability to reach an audience. And I think on net, that's a totally positive thing. If there's a downside to that, and I think this is where it really crosses over to news and media and politics, is there aren't as many gatekeepers. So I think many of us might agree that gatekeepers tended to be white and male throughout American history, and that's less the case now. That's all good. But there is something comfortable about a world where certain editors decided what books were going to be created, certain labels decided what albums were going to be put out. We missed out on a lot of good writing by women and minorities. We missed out on a lot of good music that might have been made. So for me, even as an old school guy, I salute the democratization of content that technology's enabled, but I also recognize, and I don't have an answer for what Mike's talking about, which is, well, the good news is you can get your news from a global menu of options, but you're maybe not going to have someone say, but this is really the truth. And I think when we were growing up, we kind of were able, even if it was an illusion, there was this understanding that when you watch the news, that's objective. We're getting the news. And I think Mike's analogy about the car wreck is really on point, because even people looking at the same thing in real time are going to have a different reaction. I think that's what gets us into social media and how that genie's out of the bottle. How do we navigate a world where everyone's opinion now can be broadcast? And I don't know if there's a question there so much as how does social media and the fact that for better or worse, we're probably not going to not have it. How do you suggest, or what is your take or perspective on navigating all the things we're talking about, and then adding social media, which, again, it could be a force for good, often isn't, but as it relates to political messaging, media, news, how do we navigate engagement versus, knowing how to ignore the noise, a lot of the noise?
Yeah, I come at this probably a little bit from my own libertarian sort of perspective, that all of the solutions that we could come up with to solve the problem of social media are onerous, unfortunately. So it's like you just can't win, because there's a very toxic thing in our lives on social media, but then the solutions to it are also not great, because it winds up with state control and censorship and that sort of thing. And so, it all falls back on our shoulders once again, as a society, as a culture, as people, to sort through this on our own. One of the things that, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I had a class at Georgetown that I taught that was just sort of touching on some of these topics, and I was pointing out to them that the unfortunate thing about even social media that are owned by corporations whose are writing algorithms, and they are designing the profit model for a social media company is to make us all really angry and fight each other. That's literally what it's designed for. And we were told it was designed for us to communicate with each other and share pictures of our kids, and we can use it for that. But that's not what drives the energy and the clicks and therefore the money on social media. What drives it is us splitting apart. And to me, the only solution for that is to quit using it. It's like any other thing that's harming you, whether it's a drug, whether it's gambling, whether it's alcohol, anything that's bad for you, eating bad food. There is, sure, you can eat bad food and then go on Ozempic and keep, there's some things in life you can get away with that. But generally speaking, the only real solution is the hardest one, which is stop doing it. And the encouraging thing for the students in that class was, and they're obviously your age, or they're a little older at this point, because they had been raised where everything they'd ever known from social media was that it could be a very toxic place, they were turning away from it. They were trying to find ways to communicate with people that weren't toxic and that they weren't going to take part in it. Is that, how resonant is that with you? Are you trapped in something that you think is too toxic, or do you feel like your generation is trying to find ways to turn away from that toxicity?
Show of hands, who would like to spend less time on social media? Who thinks they spend just the right amount of time? Who wants to spend more time? I asked a similar question to a group last semester, and I was surprised. The show of hands, it was unanimous that most people were like to spend less time on my phone and on social media. And I thought that united the younger generation with our peer group, because when I talk to friends of our peer group, our age group, generally most people are saying, whether they mean it or not, or whether they intend to do anything about it, the general sentiment seems to be we're controlled by our devices, and too much of this raises the blood pressure, raises the temperature, and on net, it's doing what Mike described, which is it's getting us fired up. We're kind of pawns in this game of, get them fighting, put content out there, put it in their algorithms that they will be engaged if they're angry as opposed to happy. And I think that gets us at the real nuts and bolts of story, right? Like as coming at it as a writer, someone that's written fiction and poetry and novels, the rules are pretty simple. You have to write something that entertains people. You don't have to do that. You could write a book and people don't have to like it, but you can't complain if you make music or you write books that aren't engaging and entertaining because they're not going to sell. So that kind of polices itself. But when we get into politics, what I've always been fascinated by is to do it well, you're still telling a good story. And it gets into, is it what people want to hear? Is it what they need to hear? And I think there's an art in weaving that. Mike, can you talk a little bit about the use of story, narrative, any direction, the good, the bad, the ugly, the cynicism, but ultimately, right, it's a very similar impulse, which is to get people to buy in, whether it's a book or a candidate. It's storytelling. It's getting some kind of message across clearly and effectively. Where does the rubber meet the road in the art of storytelling in politics?
Yeah, I'm in the business of campaigns, and so I don't want to oversell the role that we play in some senses, in that if you have candidate A and they're just a great candidate, what we do may not make any difference as to whether or not they win or lose. But where campaigns do make a difference, the successful ones use storytelling effectively. And where they don't, they usually fail at that. And so it is that important. It is that big of a deal. When someone is running for office, they are more successful when they connect with voters at a human level. If I just put a picture up here of random politician in a suit and tie, a little square picture, and said, here are the 4 things they stand for. You might agree with those 4 things, you might disagree, but it's a pretty two-dimensional image of somebody. Most politicians, you can put into that box at some level. And so you can run a campaign just based on that and say, look, here are the 4 things they stand for. Let's go find the people that agree with them and get them to vote. And you may win. Rarely do you. You're going to be much more successful when you can say, here's why they stand what they stand for. Here's why they believe what they believe. And that's my point about treating the voters like a jury and that you're prosecuting a case, because the most powerful element of any political message for me, and this is my philosophy and how we built our agency, is motive. If you can connect with people on motive, it is a dramatic impact on what decision that they're making. And that's true selling products, that's true for trusting somebody, anybody. Any friendship you have, any information you get from a news source, when you understand what their motive is, or if you don't trust their motive, dramatically impacts how you receive information. It could be the exact same information, but the motive behind why you're getting it matters. And so we have, and I say this as someone who grew up in Europe, Americans still have to this day a George Washington obsession, who is a person above reproach in our lore and our mindset, above party, who had traits that were king-like in a sense, but weren't a king. And so we created this position of president, and we have ever since looked at politicians as people that we want to have certain characters and traits in how they behave. It's an individualistic approach to politics, which is also very deeply embedded in American culture. And we think that everyone's like that, but actually they're not. Other countries care less about the personal traits. The French president has 5 mistresses and lied on his taxes. So what? Is he doing a good job? I hired him to run the country. In the past has been a much more common thing. Whereas here, we care about who they are and how they act and what kind of person they are. We want to feel connected to them, and that means that in our system, the story really matters because we want to know what their story is. What's their motive? Where are they coming from? Why are they doing the things that they're doing? Is it compelling? Am I curious as to what they're going to do next? I mean, certainly one of the successes of President Trump is that he hasn't captured an audience that has I want to see what he's going to do next. People that love or hate him pay attention because they're going, what's he going to do next? Oh my gosh, what's the next thing? That's all part of a storytelling approach. And then finally, the most common word that you'll hear in marketing rooms and campaigns for a candidate when we first start talking to the candidate is narrative. One of the things that we do with all of our clients is that we interview them. Even though we've known them, we sit down and we actually interview them multiple times throughout a campaign so that we can mine them for aspects of their life that are authentic, that we can help them explain and tell a story about themselves to the voters that are beyond the politics, beyond the little square picture you see. Something about the relationship they have with their parents or with their family, or something that they overcame, something that was difficult, some challenge that they met, something that the voters can connect with, because what we end up wanting to see is we want to see ourselves in our leaders. We want to see our challenges being met by them. And there's a difference there between a hero and a champion. A hero is someone we admire upon a hill. A champion is someone fighting for us and carrying a flag up the hill on our behalf. And the only way that we can trust that is if we know, they went through something hard like I did. They understand what I'm going through. And so that the final piece of that is that it requires a modern candidate to come across as very authentic. And that is where social media has really broken down a lot of walls from the sort of curated, almost actor-type advertising in the 80s and even the 70s that was sort of an archetype of a politician to, I want to see what it's like when they're making dinner with their wife and going to the coffee shop and talking to people, because I start to trust them more, I believe their motive more, I start to understand their narrative arc more, I see how they relate to people, they feel authentic to me, and so that's the basis of how we have to now build stories into campaigns.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about, or I mentioned how, I'll get you 1 second, the news now, right, is a 24/7 proposition. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's still true. Any of us that use social media effectively, for fun, for business, we are brand building. Even in our own lives, we're telling our stories. In fact, I think, is it still called like a story, your Facebook story? The stakes have been raised considerably for politicians, and I'm going to get your question, and then I want Mike maybe to weigh in a little bit about how That's changed the complexion of candidates and campaigns because now there's no time off. And the curated persona that used to be, again, like the news itself, for centuries was a pretty, the process was pretty tried and true. Social media has now made it so that everyone's on camera, both literally and figuratively, all the time. But yeah, you had a question in the back.
Do you feel like social media has also had the opposite effect, where like because there's no regulation on what can be said truthfully or untruthfully or just perspective-wise, like that is also for politicians' stories, where like people can just kind of say whatever they want and what people do because there's such a distrust in the media, like there's room for hurt there as well.
Yeah, bless you. Yes, the question was, does social media hurt the narrative process because you can lie about something or say something that isn't true and now your story is controlled by somebody else? And yes, that is certainly true. I think that was always true, actually. So someone could run for office and let's say pre-social media, they wanted to get the word out. They may have a good story. They've got to raise enough money to be able to tell it. Someone else has more money than them and tells a different story, and now their story's different. So that has happened to almost everyone who runs for office. The interesting thing, and so yes, I agree. Yes, for the most part, that is true. But social media, it cuts both ways. If you know what you're doing, then you can fight back on that. You can use it to curate the truth and to say to people, this isn't true, and let me show you how it's not true very quickly, right? So in the past, something may be written or said about you that's not true, and then it's like, I gotta wait for the next news cycle, I've gotta get enough money to be able to tell people this. Now you can go, let me get online right now and just do a live and tell everyone exactly what's happening and why this isn't true. So the speed of it is really fast, and there's a push and pull on both sides, so it's kind of an equal, like the rules are fair for both sides on that, in a way that they may not have been before. Because before, if you had more access to one thing or another, you had an advantage over somebody that you may not have now. So yes, I mean, the truth goes around the world before a lie goes around the world before the truth gets their boots on, is the old phrase, right? And certainly something can get online that's not true, that can be very damaging, and a narrative can get set. And it can be very difficult to unring that bell and to unwind it. But that was always true, and so at least now, when you've been lied about and it's going everywhere, you do still actually have some way of actually combating it, because you used to never be able to combat it.
Before I go, yeah.
I just want to chime in on that. I think part of what you're saying is for sure true, but when we consider the algorithm, which you mentioned before, all of us, we might have an opinion that we share on social media, but it's not equal. And part of that could also be due to, money that you might spend to, prop up whatever comment. But we know that these different social media websites, the algorithm can suppress certain people's opinions. So it's not really as democratic as we'd all like to believe it to be, right? And it makes it difficult to really share the truth and your story, especially if you don't have the money to do that, right?
No, I agree with you. My contention was it was never democratic, even before this. There were gatekeepers that decided this is a story, this is the truth. We're going to report on, I don't know if you are ever familiar with the 1996 Atlanta bomber story, Richard Jewell. He was a failed many times to become a policeman and became a paid security guard. The bomb goes off. Because he's into security stuff as like a hobby, he takes a piece of the bomb as a souvenir, which none of us would recommend. He winds up getting raided, and the media and everyone just decided they wanted to find the culprit, so they decided he was the bad guy. And it wasn't true, but the media just decided this guy was guilty, and so that has always been a problem. And I'm not saying that many times, many thoughtful people in the media try to be responsible, but it's human nature. When you're trying to get ratings, when you're trying to beat your competitors, mistakes get made. And but there's a movie called Richard Jewell that's, I think, a great film, tells the story very well. he had absolutely no ability to push back on it. There was no recourse. There's nothing he could do other than, I mean, he didn't even know that to sue or to do those sorts of things. So yes, you're right, the algorithm can just curate a story and a group of people are gonna hear something and they're never gonna hear the other side of it. Just as if CNN decided it was CNN for picking up CNN a lot, I don't mean to do that, but they were the ones that really got in trouble for Richard Jewell. But what I'm saying is at least now there are other outlets where you can at least find some audiences where you could push back, whereas in the past you couldn't do that. And don't believe me, I'm not saying, isn't social media great? But I'm just saying there is another side to the story there about the democratization of media, where you can get voices that are everyday people can take part in it in a way that they couldn't before when they're wrongfully accused.
Other questions or comments? Yeah.
The Fairness in Reporting Act died in the 80s or 90s. Do you think it's even possible to bring that back, or is that totally done?
I think it would be impossible. I don't know how you would get critical mass around legislating fairness in the media at this point. It's so polarized, it's so heated, and the media's estimation is so low. All you're seeing, and by the way, keep in mind, I don't know if you're saying, could you adjust that to some form of online version, or if you're just talking about what it was originally intended for, which was the more established mainstream media, because that also, the other part about that you have to understand is that media is dying. I mean, their newspapers are closing, being bought up, they're consolidating, they're kind of Amazoning, that big companies own so many different publications and it's all just getting swallowed up. And so I think it would be impossible for that. In terms of regulating speech on the internet, I think it would be even harder. I mean, we're kind of going in the other direction where the big tech companies tried to self-police that, and there was a big backlash to it. And so for the government to do it, I think would really cause a lot of problems. And it would be very difficult because people would just, motives, they would just believe that whoever was pushing that was only doing it because they were trying to close out a thing they didn't agree with. And so I don't know how you would get people to trust that that wasn't happening anymore.
So I would be missing an opportunity if I didn't put Mike on the spot a little bit and get him to weigh in on how storytelling has worked effectively. But I'm going to offer up two quick examples just for my own, to show you how I process story, because we still kind of stayed within the box, which is good. Ultimately, the campaign's job is to take the salient positive qualities and amplify them. But of course, the art of campaigning is that you can create your own narrative. So what I think we've seen change, and I want Mike to educate me if I'm wrong and naive about this, but what we've seen become weaponized, and it's just been fascinating, is that political campaigns of both parties have learned that not only do you try to exploit a weakness of another candidate, but in fact, you take an ostensible strength or an actual strength and use that against them. And to me, as a writer, it's a fascinating way of subverting narrative and creating narrative. The examples that I would use, just two off the top of my head, would be one, full respect, and I think this encompasses everything that I talk about when I talk about story and how it's everything. Before Donald Trump even got into politics, right, he had been, again, for better or worse, he was on a reality TV show called The Apprentice. And there was a very concerted effort to create with him an expert businessman. So no matter whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, he had perfected an image that was cemented in Americans' minds as, whatever else you think about this guy, a bunch of wives or the things he says are weird, he is an expert business person. So whether that was actually true was almost irrelevant, because the story had been so powerfully created that he was an expert business person. We might be able to trust him to make big business decisions. I think that's just an interesting example of how that became political, but before politics were part of it, that story had worked. And then I think an example that I would use, which I just tip my hat to the brilliance, in 2004, so this is already kind of ancient history, but Kerry, who was the Democratic candidate, was a veteran, and at the time George W. Bush was noted as not having had military history. So the conventional wisdom was, we got to stay away from that because Kerry has just everything about the military. But the opposing campaign turned that into a potential weakness, and I think that opened up something that maybe hadn't been explored before, and now with all bets being off, that's what I mean when I say, and I'm not being sarcastic, like the art of political campaigning, it doesn't really matter what someone's backstory is, because you can use that in ways that they might not want, and they can't control the narrative anymore. So again, it's not fair. I'm not really asking a question so much as I'd love you to weigh in on what are the pros and cons, or
I think, look, this is where I don't 100% agree with the premise of that, because in the end, it's like bringing evidence in front of a jury.
Yeah.
And the job of a prosecutor or a defense attorney is to impeach the credibility of an expert witness. It is to explain why someone did something while they're trying to tell you they didn't do it. Right. And then the jury is trusted as our peers to be smart enough to kind of weigh both of those things and then come to an end result. And so if you are saying, I'm a successful business person, and there's literally no evidence of that whatsoever, none, then then the American people see through that. They will fall on its face. If there's enough evidence, maybe you've made some mistakes and you had a casino shut down, but you have a jet, you're a billionaire, you got a huge tower, you've obviously, there's businesses that you run that are successful. On balance, they can say that image, at least there's an element of truth to that, and we can debate it. Yeah. The other side can try to make it a weakness and say it isn't true, and then the jury's going to go, I think it is true, or I don't, or whatever. With John Kerry, the reason why he was vulnerable was because he had become an anti-war protester after his service, and took his medals and threw them into the Potomac and testified in front of Congress against the war. And so that was put in front of the jury as evidence. This person they've said you should trust them because they're a veteran, and so we have a war going on, and then the prosecution is allowed to come to the jury and say, yeah, but did you know these things about it? And so what's interesting to me from a storytelling perspective, without picking sides in any of that, is good stories have twists and turns. If you're an objective person watching the 10-part series of the 2004 election, it's like, oh, a cliffhanger, now this is going, there's a new turn, like the war hero is getting attacked for nothing, how's he going to respond? And and so that is campaigns. There's a reason why we have a campaign. You don't just decide, you don't get married on the first date, and you don't have the election without having a campaign where you get a chance to have the evidence put in front of you. And so there are twists and turns. People are up and then down in polls. They make mistakes. They have a debate and they say something wrong. There's a part of them that comes out. They've curated an image for themselves. And this is outside of, I'm just saying in a Senate campaign I might work on. They curated an image of themselves, a certain thing, and then they go and screw it up and say the completely wrong thing. Or yell at some little old lady at a rally or something, and you go, oh my gosh, this is not who they said they were.
Right.
And so the story arc, when you're telling the story looking backwards on what happened in the campaign, there's a huge seminal moment where the story changed to that person's narrative arc of who they were. And so that to me is where yes, both sides are competing in their stories. Right. And not only am I trying to establish the motive of my candidate, I'm trying to ruin the motive of my opponent. I'm trying to tell you their motives are wrong. They're not doing this because of what they said they're doing. They're doing it because they want money, they want power, and they're just using you to get it, or whatever it is. And we're going to put all that in front of the voters and say, okay, which motive do you think is right? And then they get to decide.
So maybe I thank you for that. Whether it's from recent history or just any history, give us an example of something that you hold up as like a seminal, like a brilliant use of story and narrative in a campaign. Or even a surprising one where you can say, like, here's where the art of storytelling came in, and it wasn't the media, it wasn't some random events that could have been foreseen.
I'm so bad at this. It's putting me on the spot. Like
See, I thought this would be low hanging fruit.
No, I mean, I can think
Or
of
the opposite, an example so if I were to tee it up to you as both a friend and an expert, I'd say, from my own personal opinion, I've found over the years that for a variety of reasons, Democratic candidates have tended to not be as effective at cogently and incisively telling stories that are easily understandable, that hit people in the feels. Any thoughts on either party and what some of the mistakes that they make, or things that befuddle you? Like, how can they not be better at this? Either party or either.
Yeah, I just think that waxes and wanes.
Uh-huh.
I think it comes and goes. I think there are some candidates that come along and they're just great at telling a story about themselves. I mean, Bill Clinton was absolutely brilliant at it. He came from a little place called Hope, Arkansas, and that was a story, a narrative. He grew up with an alcoholic father, I believe, and so he wove that into his motive, his backstory. Every superhero has a backstory. We want to know what our backstories are, which again, it goes back to that Washington obsession that we have. I think that both parties have done it quite well. I mean, I thought Obama did a fantastic job of that. I mean, Barack Obama was someone who ran for Congress. The machine in Chicago wouldn't let him have the nomination. Then he got elected to the state Senate to kind of stick it to him, and then ran from that for the U.S. Senate, and then within his first term of U.S. Senate was elected President of the United States. I mean, like, whoa, kind of coming out of nowhere. And all through that, he had this story of being different, being an outsider, being somebody that was going to be completely, a change person that could bring hope. And there was a lot of different elements to the narrative that he brought, and we can, partisan-wise, we can argue about all that stuff, but there have certainly been Democrats that I think have done a fantastic job of it. So I don't think that, I actually really don't think that fits with one party or the other. I think that, for instance, there's one of the things that Rahm Emanuel did pretty well in 2006 was make a conscious decision that Democrats needed to start recruiting more veterans. That veterans seem to be more in the Republican Party in general, and the military does skew as an institution more conservative, but that there were Democrats that he thought that he could recruit. And why are veterans so great? Because they have the best built-in motive arc of anybody you could. They have a narrative story and a motive that's unimpeachable. They're willing to die for their country. They're a public servant. They're not in it for money. That's what they bring to the table. And so, you could go down the line of all the veteran candidates that the Democrats brought in from 06 particular forward that really Rahm started. So I just think that kind of comes and goes. I think that good candidates are good candidates, and they can be in either party. And then some people are just super ambitious, and you're trying to attach a story to them. What we really like in this country are we tend to not like as much the career politician who is ambitious and keeps trying to climb the tree. We want people who have been who have served our community already and been leaders. They've employed people in the business, or they've worked in a public service sector in some other way that we would like to elevate to lead us because we think that they're doing a good job. And so that sort of story worked better than, well, I worked in the legislature as a staffer, then I got elected as a state rep, then I became a state senator, then I became a lieutenant governor, now I'm running for Congress because I'm probably going to run for the Senate in the White House one day. Now I will say, I think that does actually work a little bit better in the Democratic Party because they revere government service and public service a little more, so it doesn't hurt as much. But even in the Democratic Party, when you get in a primary, being an outsider, not a part of the system,
Right.
Just has a better brand. And it certainly does in the Republican Party. And so, that narrative can come on either side. I think that there's a lot of candidates that do it well. And what you hate is when you know someone has a good story and it isn't told very well. Because it's like, oh my God, you actually had all the ingredients that you needed.
Right.
And you still weren't able to put it together and have people understand that about you, as opposed to somebody who really didn't have much of a story, but the 2 or 3 things that they could talk about themselves, they seem to do pretty well. Just from an objective, almost academic perspective, it's hard to watch sometimes when you see that.
Yeah. So speaking of public service and politics, Mike, do you have any advice for anyone that is thinking about I want to pursue a career there, I don't know where to start, or it was different from when you were young.
Well, I'm not just saying this because I think it's probably what you want me to say, because I actually mean it, but being a writer is a talent that it was rare when I was coming up. It is even more rare. People that know how to write are invaluable in policy making, in politics, in marketing in general. We just, as someone, I have a staff of about 25, and the average age is probably 26, 27 years old in that staff. I have a lot of young people who work for me. And even when we're doing online marketing and email fundraising, they have to be able to write to do it. There's still a written communication as a part of it. And it is a skill set that is, you're only good at it if you keep doing it. When you stop doing it, your skills diminish, just like speaking another language. And I'm constantly looking for writers. I'm looking for people that have the ability to communicate through prose. And so that's the first place that I would go. I'm guessing you would say that's what you want someone to say. But and then I think in our business you have to follow what you believe. It's too hard to do it. You're not going to get paid very much when you get started to do something that you don't believe in. And I think that's probably true in almost every career field. And so having a passion for it so that you enjoy it and it makes you better at it, so you're going to rise faster because you actually like what you're doing and you're doing that extra little piece. And so that's a super, super important part. And obviously, whatever your beliefs are, or whatever thing that you're interested in, I would make sure that that's a huge element of it. And then the third part is that you have to really work hard. Politics is not the tech industry where the youngest people push out older people because they're closer to the audience and closer to the technology. It is a flight hours business. You are trusted to be in charge of the cockpit because you have flown second seat for hours and hours. You've gone through storms and lightning strikes, and then eventually people start to care what you think about. And I think that's a wake-up call for a lot of young people when they come into my industry, because they're full of vigor, and I think unlike our generation a little bit, they've been encouraged to share their voice more, which is not a bad thing. But in a professional environment, they've still got to learn. They've still got to prove that they know what they're doing and that they can be trusted, because you don't have judgment yet because you just haven't had enough experience. And so if you're willing to work hard, you will get that experience, right? That paradigm of like, well, we can't hire you because you don't have experience, but you can't get experience because I wasn't hired, that I know young people go through. If you're willing to just work and do grunt work and work your way up, you'll get experience. And so that's the hack for everything, in my opinion, is just be willing to do that 4 a.m. job that people turn their nose up at, and you will get experience, and eventually you'll have the magical thing where someone comes to you and says one day, what do you think? And they ask you your opinion on something. So that's probably the first 3 places I would say if you're going to do politics or policy work, that's where you have to start.
Right on. Well, I wasn't looking for a writer, although it makes me happy. But one of the reasons that I have and continue to advocate